Hello. This week we're going to look at some common ethical issues in the human services. We'll talk about confidentiality and boundaries and dual relationships. And we'll also look at a couple of issues from last week, informed consent and termination, and also touch on the area of competence. So we're going to want to describe some common ethical dilemmas and maybe explore some ethical guidelines for resolving these. So first I'd like to have you look at this quote from Frederick Reamer, and he is a social work professor at Rhode Island College with a long background in social work, working in many different areas of social work. But one area that he specializes in is professional ethics, and he's published numerous books and articles on this subject. He travels all over the country giving presentations, and he often comes to Seattle to present on ethics. And he worked on the task force that created the NASW Code of Ethics. So, what Professor Reamer has to say is that social workers who find themselves in ethic related mistakes or issues often don't get there because of serious misconduct, but rather you can just describe them as mistakes, mistakes made by talented, conscientious, and dedicated practitioners. As he says, social workers who slip on the banana peel, ethical banana peel. So, just to say that we will all make mistakes in our professional career, and we will all violate ethics in our professional career. But I think the most important thing to think about is to be conscious, to be knowledgeable about what the Code of Ethics says and what the laws say, and to be conscious at all times when you're working with clients about these codes and laws, and to be proactive in thinking about where mistakes could happen. So these are some common risk areas for human service practitioners, which I mentioned before, and we'll just go through them one by one. So first, in the area of competence, um, you should accurately represent yourself and your skills to clients, and your agency should also accurately represent itself and what it provides. And you should develop a referral base so that you can refer clients if your skills don't match their needs or if your agency's services do not match their needs. It's not ethical to experiment on clients, which is not to say that at times you won't do that. You may have just learned a new technique or skill, and you will then have to practice on clients. But what would be ethical in that situation is to get supervision regularly on your practice, to do a lot of research related to that skill, to keep up with the literature, to get continuing education hours. This is required for licensure at the master's level, but it's also ethical for you to continue to educate yourself on the advances of the profession. Some common ethical violations related to competence are misrepresenting your qualifications or licensure, practicing an area in which you have not been trained or outside of your area of expertise, and not getting adequate supervision. Related to informed consent, which we talked about last week, um, informed consent is based on the kind of ethical principles or values of client autonomy and client self-determination. So we want our clients to be fully informed about what they're getting into in the helping situation with us and our agency. So the informed consent process is one in which you as the helping professional are providing your clients with complete and accurate information about the services that are going to be provided to them so that they can make an informed, knowledgeable choice about whether they want to get involved with these services or not. So you need to be very clear about what the nature of the intervention or services provided are and what consequences or limitations there are to the services. And related to informed consent is the right of informed refusal. So, for example, if a client is mandated to services by the court or some other body, what are their rights to refuse and what are the consequences? That should be part of your informed consent process. What other options do they have if they don't want your services? And also, if you're working with a client who has agreed to the process you're working with and you want to offer them something additional, you need to give them the right to refuse to do that before you offer that additional service. So these are some examples of informed consent violations: failure to inform clients fully about the goals, techniques, and limitations of the service provided, failure to ensure that the client's consent has not been coerced. So, for example, if a parent is making their adolescent child come to counseling, you want to help them to want to be in counseling, but you don't want them to be coerced into it. You want to ensure that clients are mentally capable of providing consent. So, someone who has a developmental disability or dementia, they might not be able to provide consent. But you still want to try to explain the service to them at a level where they might be able to understand, even if someone else, their guardian, for example, is providing the consent. You want to give not just get verbal consent, but also written consent, so you have it documented that the client has seen in writing what the services are and has signed a paper saying that they are interested in those services and understand all the issues that we'll talk about in a minute in terms of what is in the informed consent process. So this is not an exhaustive list of what to include in the informed consent process, and it will vary by the type of agency and the type of work you do. But these are some of the kind of at the very least things you would want to include. So what is your expertise, your experience, your training, your philosophy or approach? These are things that the client should know about. What are the services that are going to be provided by you and the agency, including the risks and the benefits of those services? And what does the helping process look like? What is your role as a helper and what are its limitations? When will you meet, or when will the activity happen? What days and what times? How long do you think the services will last? Is it an 8-week treatment program? Are you going to be working with the client, you think, for about 3 months? The client should know in advance all these things. What are the record keeping practices of your agency? Who has access to the client's records? What are the limits to confidentiality? And we're going to be talking about that in a few minutes. Are there any fees or billing? Or does the agency bill DSHS or the client's insurance company? All these things should be, what is the client liable for? And you should make sure the client knows they have the right to terminate services at any time. And if you also have that right, you need to say why you might terminate services. And then let's talk a little bit about confidentiality. Confidentiality is related to the issues of privacy, stigma, and trust. So when people enter into services with a counselor or human services worker, they have a right to have those services be private. What they talk about in there, what your impressions are of them, that is private, privileged information. And we'll talk a little bit more about when that isn't the case. And also, because there is stigma associated with problems that people seek help for, like mental illness or chemical dependency or domestic violence or child abuse, that also means that they have the right to confidentiality. They can much more freely work on those issues if they know that not everyone will know about that. Um, it also, confidentiality helps to build trust. If a client knows that the information they're sharing with you is being kept confidential, it helps them to build trust for you and for the process of helping. And confidentiality is not just an ethical mandate, but a legal one. Federal and state laws apply to, to confidentiality. So these are some examples of confidentiality violations. Disclosing information to law enforcement or to media representatives about clients. Releasing sensitive information such as HIV/AIDS diagnosis or substance abuse. disclosing information about deceased clients, releasing information about minors to parents and guardians, sharing information with clients' family members, or sharing on social media about the tough client you are working with today. Um, disclosing information to insurance or third-party payers, disclosing information in public or semi-public areas, such as when you're teaching a class or during legal proceedings. All of these have laws related to them, as well as um, ethical principles, and so unless these areas fall into the exceptions to confidentiality, you need to keep the confidentiality of the client in these areas. And it's a little bit nuanced, so we'll talk a little bit more about it. In terms of documentation and confidentiality, federal rules such as HIPAA and HITECH apply to privileged health communication or privileged health information, and many human service agencies fall in this category. You need to consider who has access to client records, how the records are stored, are they locked, who has access to the key, um, what are the rules around record retention, how long do you need to keep a client's records, and how are they disposed of when it's time to dispose of them. And not just in terms of clinical documentation like case notes or patient files, but also clinic appointment and billing systems need to be confidential, and how you communicate with clients through phone, Skype, email, and text messaging are all issues that you need to think about in terms of client confidentiality. Now, there are exceptions to confidentiality, and these are ones that you also need to tell the client about in an informed consent process. So you will be talking about your clients in supervision or in a consulting group, possibly, and you'll need to let the client know that that is something that will happen. You'll need to communicate with other professionals within your agency or sometimes outside of your agency, and those might require different kinds of client consent. If the client is a danger to self or others, or if you believe that is the case, there are reporting requirements for that, as well as if you suspect abuse or neglect. If you are subpoenaed, or if you are called to be an expert witness, you may have to reveal some things about the client in those situations, and you need to understand the laws related to that. And again, when you are billing an insurance company or third-party payer, the client needs to release information related to that, but those things might be what the diagnosis of the client is, what the progress of the client is at your agency. And then I just wanted to point out a particular law that many of you probably have heard of, or a particular piece of legislation, Tarasoff versus Regents of University of California. In this case, I think you read about it in your book, the duty to warn is not just to the authorities, but to the intended victim when a client is indicating they're going to harm someone. So this is a case that applies to California, but other states have also adopted similar laws, and so you need to understand, what the laws of your state are related to all these issues when you're going to be working in an agency. So some ways to protect client confidentiality is to first discuss the limits of that confidentiality during the informed consent process, as I mentioned earlier. Ensure that clients' records are stored safely, either physically or electronically. Know federal and state laws related to confidentiality. And when you're writing case notes or talking about a client, just include the minimum amount of information that's required in order for you to be able to follow the client's case through the case notes, or for someone else to be able to pick up the client case, or if you're referring a client, the minimum required information so that they get the services they need. You really want to be able to protect client information as much as possible. You need to obey mandatory reporting laws. And in our world of electronics, when you're keeping client information on a computer, you should consider encryption software. Let's look at a typical scenario. how should you respond if you meet a client on the street, a client who you're working with right now or a client that you worked with in the past? If you greet the client, you might be violating their confidentiality and their privacy. If you don't, he or she may feel ignored or confused or abandoned. What about if you're with other people? Or if a client greets you and you say hello and those people ask, your family asks you, how do you know this person? What should you do? So this is a pretty common situation. It's very common if you live in a small community where you might go to church with a client or live in the same neighborhood or have children in the same school. But it happens in Seattle and big cities too. I've often found myself on the bus with a client or walking down the street and seeing a client. And the longer you work in human services, the more likely this is to happen to you. And then there's also the possibility that you might see a client doing something they shouldn't be doing, like a client in your recovery program who you see drinking, or a client in the domestic violence shelter where you work who you see meeting her abuser. So this is a awkward situation for both you and the client, and you should take care not to violate the client's confidentiality. In general, a good rule of thumb is to let the client control the situation. If you walk by a client and they ignore you, you should let that be how it happens. If they come up and talk to you, then you can respond to them. But you need to take care, if you're with other people, how you handle that. And I think one thing that's really important is to think about this proactively. When you're in the actual situation, you're not going to have time to think through a whole ethical decision-making process. So it'd be useful for you to plan out this type of situation in advance. You might actually, have this discussion when you're going through the informed consent process with your client. You might suppose this hypothetical situation. If we run into each other on the street or at an event, how would you like to handle it? And let the client think about it as well and decide. And you and your client can come up with a plan together about how you might handle such things. So let's move on to what is probably the most common and the potentially most egregious of, of ethical violations, and that's related to boundary violations or related to having dual or multiple relationships with clients. And so this means that in addition to having a professional helping role with a client, you have another kind of relationship with a client. That might be a social relationship. It might be a sexual relationship. Hopefully not. It might be a relationship in your religious community or some kind of business or financial relationship with the client. It may be that the client is your teacher or you're the client's teacher. There may be an example of where a student or a friend or a family member has asked you to provide counseling services to them. Also problematic are dual relationships with colleagues, supervisors, subordinates, students. And so we're going to talk about this issue a little bit more. So one element of dual relationships is that there's an inherent conflict of interest. And this means that there's a conflict between your role as an objective person serving your client and another interest you have in the client that could interfere with your objectivity or your professional judgment. So as I said, it's when your personal or financial or other interests clash with your professional interests related to the client. And this conflict can lead to undue influence. You have, a lot of power in your relationship with the client, and clients trust you, consider you the expert, and how you use that power can be construed as undue influence. So the article, I think that's the article by Reamer, is the one that talks about the difference between boundary violations and boundary crossings. So a boundary violation is a overt, willful, conscious violation, basically, or where it can be considered exploitative, manipulative, deceptive, or coercive. And it's characterized by the power it has to both impair your professional judgment and hurt or exploit the client. A boundary crossing, which is probably more common or more that we might more likely to encounter more frequently, is when you have a dual relationship with a client that isn't exploitative, manipulative, deceptive, or coercive inherently or willfully, um, though it could turn out that way, and that this boundary crossing may have been unintentional or it may be unavoidable because of the community you live in or the groups that you belong to. And it's a situation that could have positive results or it could have bad results or it could have mixed results. It's not a clear-cut situation like a boundary violation is. So some examples of boundary crossings are related to self-disclosure. Sometimes it is therapeutic, necessary to self-disclose some things to your client. It might be very useful in their healing process and your work together. Sometimes attending a client's graduation or some other life event is something that would be useful for you to do. Um, Whether your agency hires a former client as a peer educator, whether you find out you attend the same church as your client, these things could be just fine, or they could have terrible negative consequences, and it's something that you really have to think through. Boundary violations are much more clear cut. Having a sexual relationship with a client, that's just something you never do. It's not even a question. But the boundary crossing issues are things that are, not so clear cut. So let's look at how Reamer has broken down the different categories of boundary violations. And this is found in the article. It's not very clear here on the slide because I just cut and pasted it, but you can find it in the assigned article if you want to look at it more closely. So in terms of intimate relationships, a helping relationship might be described as a one-way intimate relationship where the client is sharing a lot with you. You are not sharing a lot with the client, except yourself, but not your intimate details of yourself. And in terms of intimate relationships, sexual misconduct is a significant issue in the helping professions. It is the most frequent situation where a lawsuit is filed against a helping professional. And I think in the article it said something like 8 to 12% of male counselors have engaged in some kind of sexual contact with a client. I was a little bit shocked and surprised by that and hope it is not really true. So in addition to it being prohibited to engage in sexual relationships with clients, it also is prohibitive to do it with clients' relatives or with your supervisor or with your student, etc. Sexual relationships are among the most damaging of all ethical violations, and they are a felony in some states. All helping profession ethics codes have prohibitions against it. Physical contact is also something that is a little bit challenging, and in the article it talks about like hugging your client, touching your client, and I think just being very cautious about those things. Providing services to a former partner, also something that would be a boundary violation. And then thinking about sort of the different types of intimate gestures. Gift giving, affectionate notes, forming a friendship with a client or a former client, attending client special events. Not all of these are prohibited, but they require some very careful thought. Having a relationship with a client that is to your personal benefit or monetary gain. So that might be becoming a former student's paid clinical supervisor, being named in a client's will, selling a client your daughter's Girl Scout cookies or whatever it is someone's selling at your school. Entering into a bartering arrangement where in exchange for services the client comes and paints your house. Referring a client to your husband's business. Consulting with a client to get free expert advice. Getting a ride home from your client. All these are potential boundary violations. Having your emotional dependency needs met by clients or by your colleagues or supervisees, these are also boundary violations. Needing to be the hero to save someone, to have your role be so caught up, your life be so caught up in your professional role that it's confusing. Self-disclosing to me your own support needs, sharing too much with a client to get your needs met. These are also boundary violations. Altruistic gestures when you're generally trying to help someone but go above and beyond the role, like being extraordinarily available to some clients, performing favors for clients, giving your clients gifts, providing other services to your clients. And then there's the unanticipated circumstances, like the situation we talked about where you're meeting a client socially and you hadn't expected to do that, or you find out that your client's cousin is your boyfriend, or whatever it is. There's many situations where you find yourself in these unanticipated circumstances and you have to figure out how to handle it. So here's some other boundary dilemmas. I'm putting more dilemmas out there than I am solutions at this moment, but they might include your supervisor suggesting that you have your supervisory meetings over lunch or over drinks, or a client complains to you that her previous worker, who happens to be your supervisor, was horrible and just didn't get it about cultural differences. Or you're a counselor at a group home and you're out enjoying a large cold beer at the local blues festival and you run into two of your clients. Or you're going on a home visit and the client greets you with a meal already and the entire family present to sit down and eat with you. So these are all boundary dilemmas that you will need to figure out how to address. So what are some ways that you can prevent or manage dual relationships and these kind of boundary issues that come with it? First of all, you should be alert to potential conflicts of interest in your relationships with clients. When you first meet a client, you'll need to think these through. If you recognize a client from some social situation, you'll need to think these through. So just be alert to the possibility of it, first of all. And then you need to ask yourself, when you're in a situation, whose needs does this situation or this relationship meet? Consider the power differential. We are working with vulnerable clients who will think that we are the expert and they'll put their trust in us. And it's our responsibility to act ethically no matter what the client says or does. We don't expect the client to have the answers, but we need to have the answers. You should consider the nature of your relationship. Did you just do an intake with this person 7 years ago, or is it someone that you had an ongoing therapeutic relationship with? Has this relationship been terminated with no chance of resuming? Follow an ethical decision-making process as you think through all the issues related to dual relationships. Bring it out into the open. One of the hallmarks of an ethical violation is that you're not willing to bring it out into the open. So you need to discuss issues wherever appropriate with the client. Definitely consult with your supervisor, with your colleagues, and document your process. And you need to consider cultural issues. In some cultures, accepting gifts or food is very important to do, attending life events. So you'll have to think of how you manage these issues in relation to culture. And then last week we talked about ethics within all the stages of the helping relationship. And termination is a common area where ethical violations occur. So some examples of challenges with the termination of services, not using the protocols that are common for terminating services, especially if you're terminating the relationship against a client's wishes. Whether that means because you're leaving your internship or because the client is not benefiting from the services in your opinion, whatever the reason is. You should also always consult with a colleague about challenging termination decisions. Failure to give clients advance warning of termination or to provide clients with what they need after the services are completed. So how do we end well? First of all, let's talk about why good endings are important in the human services profession and in the helping process. They do enhance the therapeutic work we've done with clients, and they make it possible for clients to feel good enough about the services provided to want to try services again if they need help again in the future. Not necessarily our services, but any services. I think they also help the client to resolve other unfinished business related to poor endings they've had in their past lives. And it's a way that we model appropriate endings. We help clients to build skills in this area. So you should not underestimate the impact of ending well and its clinical significance. And know the difference between when you're abandoning someone and terminating services appropriately. So it's very important to discuss from the beginning and in the informed consent process what the timeline is for the services that are being provided. Is this an 8-week, chemical dependency program? Is this a 1-month stay at a domestic violence shelter and there's no chance for staying any longer? Really be very clear at the beginning how long the services are and continue to bring up the timeline throughout the time you're working together. Involve the client in planning out the end. So you might say, we have 2 more sessions left. How would you like to use this time? And when you get to the end, review what you've done together, reflect on the success that the client has had and the progress the client has made, celebrate it, and then provide some kind of closure through ritual or some way of really providing a neat closure to the work together. And if there's next steps or referrals that need to be made, make sure those happen. So we've talked a lot about some of the many different challenges, ethical challenges we will see as professionals. And hopefully in this class, we are starting to develop some tools to address the many different kinds of challenges we can face as human services workers.